And I'm Blake Silverman, writer for Detroit Bad Boys, covering everything from the Pistons to the NBA draft and the Motor City Cruise. Yeah, you're coming through like a mouse or something. I don't know if it's just me. Okay. Yeah, Wes, we can't even hear you really, so we might need to do a false start and restart this one here. Yeah, we might have to just go back and try it. You can rejoin or whatever it might be. All right. Excuse the technical difficulties while Wes is off. He mentioned he was on a new computer, so I figured that is what is going on. So shout out to everyone for joining. Jonathan, Harry in the chat, we see you. We were planning to just talk about the week, starting from the Wizards game, because we haven't recorded since that. I mean, that feels like forever ago already for me. And then the Bulls, and then the Hornets, tough, crazy loss last night. Wes is popping back on. We'll get him added up to the stage when he can. All right, Wes is back.
Real quick, how's this?
Audio is great.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry
about that.
You sounded like a mouse. It was a little funny.
Weird. Okay, well, now that that's settled, Harry says perfect. Thank you all for bearing with us with the tech issues. But Blake, looking back at this past week, right? We've got the Wizards game where they blew them out. That was a 20-point win, 124 to 104. They lose to the Bulls, 122 to 112. And then obviously that Hornets game just the other night, 123 to, I believe, 121. Where do you want to start here? Because, it kind of was a roller coaster of a week. And even in terms of not individual, but like team effort and energy in first quarters, it was very up and down.
Yeah, I guess just zooming out, looking at the week as a whole, what stood out to me was the first two games, again, the win against Washington, the loss against Chicago, but pretty good games as far as turnovers. They turned it over 8 times as a team against Washington, 9 times against Chicago. Defense was a huge issue in that one. And Nikola Vucevic just going nuts, and the Pistons defense not being able to contain a big who can step out and stretch the floor. But good game taking care of the ball. And then against Charlotte, they turned it over 19 times to Charlotte's 15. I mean, credit to the Pistons for coming back and making that one interesting. And then once you get to overtime, just tough overall. Cade takes that foul and falls pretty hard. He misses the rest of the game. And overtime, LaMelo Ball fouls out 1 second into that game, into overtime. So the best player for each team is out of there. And then it's like, who's the best player on the court? It was clearly Brandon Miller after Cade and LaMelo were out. Jaden Ivey, I think, has an argument for that on most nights, but it just wasn't his best night. And then the Pistons got Brandon Millard at the end, and he's kind of turning into a bit of a Pistons killer, which stings. But overall, I think if you take care of the ball a little bit better, there were definitely some careless turnovers in that Charlotte game that I could spot. I think maybe you're able to pull it out in regulation, and then once Cade goes down, it's just tough overall. But I think that was the big story. I mean, it's encouraging to see a couple games where they took better care of the ball. A step back, a bit of a regression against Charlotte, but at least we know they're capable of it, and they stringed a couple of those performances in a row, even though the Chicago game was just a stinker as a whole.
Yeah, it was. And with the turnovers against the Hornets, it's kind of a tough one just because, look, like you said, yes, they had 19 turnovers, but they also forced 15. That differential really isn't all that much, especially with a game that ends up going to overtime like that. You know, that to me ends up just looking more like a very hard fought game overall, with two pretty young teams kind of making their own mistakes here and there. But otherwise, putting in a good effort. And, I completely agree. The way you described that overtime is exactly what happened. You lose LaMelo Ball to foul trouble. You lose Cade Cunningham to that injury. And it just kind of comes down to which number two is going to have the better period. And that was definitely Brandon Miller. Now, I think that Jaden Ivey's best quarter was actually overtime. And to be honest, that probably shouldn't be a shock. I think he only played 3 minutes in the first half, right? Or at least very close to it. I'm not sure he got back in after he picked up those very, very early fouls against LaMelo Ball. So it was just that's almost impossible for a guy to get a rhythm in. But then at the same time, he is the number 2 guy. Tobias Harris stepped up in his stead, and that was great. Tobias had a great night, by the way, 26 points, 8 rebounds, 2 assists. He was 6 of 9 from 3, 10 of 16 from the floor. Great game from Tobias Harris when Jaden Ivey was off. But yeah, I mean, that was just the story of overtime. Jaden Ivey couldn't get into a rhythm until then, and by then it was a little bit too late.
I mean, shout out to Jaden Ivey for that incredible free throw miss at the end that gave the Pistons
him
a shot. But when you had all of those bigs on the court and they just couldn't come up with it, I was pretty. I was like, when the game went to overtime, I was like, they're not going to pull this one out. And then when LaMelo fouled out, and then the Pistons go and get that corner 3 to Tobias on the other end, but then they didn't score after that for like a couple minutes.
Yep.
So, it essentially was just Brandon Miller was the best player on the court. He went crazy, and like you said, Jaden Ivey had that spurt where he made that 3 where he probably stepped out of bounds and the ref missed it, but it was still a great shot. And then the next possession, he had that running little like floater mid-range, which was a tough shot that is hard to make, but that kept the Pistons in it and gave them a shot at the end. So tough one to drop. I'm happy the Pistons aren't going back to Charlotte again. But yeah, overall, I think you just, especially if you had Cade in overtime, it would have been totally different, obviously. But once both him and LaMelo were out, it was a totally different game, and the Pistons just had some trouble getting some offense together.
You know what? Let's talk a little bit more about Jaden Ivey, because as strong of a start to the week as he had, he ended it with 2 not so great ones, right? So that Charlotte game we've just talked about, he gets into early foul trouble against LaMelo Ball, and just his overall numbers, tough to get into a rhythm after that with his minute total so low. He really didn't find his stride at all, I would say, until overtime, not even the fourth quarter. And then against Chicago, it's another kind of down night for him. 12 points, 5 assists, 3 rebounds, 1 of 4 from 3, 3 of 12 from the floor, 5 of 7 from the free throw line, which was good. You'll take those free throw numbers. But what have you seen from Jaden Ivey here in this little mini slump? What's kind of causing it, or is he just off?
I think he's more like, looking at Ivy and Cade, I think when someone other than those two gets going, then Ivy is more likely to lose shots from it. Like last night against Charlotte, it was Tobias Harris, and then against the Bulls, Malik Beasley had a good game. It was a combination of Tobias a little bit there as well, but I mean, he's still getting some looks, but like overall, I think Cade is still going to take his shots, even if he's not like, he didn't have a great game against Chicago either, and wasn't very efficient at all from the field against Charlotte, but he's still getting shots. And I think when there's someone else going, like Ivy just isn't getting as many opportunities and it's tough for him to get going. Like he had, let's see, he took 19 shots against the Wizards when he dropped 28 points. And then against Chicago, that dropped down to 12, and Charlotte, that dropped down to 11. So I think it's just a little tougher for him to get going, but I think it's just when other people are making shots, like he's the one that they're going to take some of those from because Cade's still going to get his.
I also think to my eye, he is, not quite settling, but I think he's going to his counters a little bit too often, or at least he did in those past couple of games against the Bulls and the Hornets. This was something that I kind of noticed the week before too, but it wasn't much of an issue as he was making the floaters he was taking. But it seemed like those kind of free throw line, a little bit closer push shots he's been taking every now and then haven't been going in against the Bulls and against the Hornets. And when he's not getting all the way to the rim as frequently as he did at the very start of the season, I wonder if maybe that's a little bit of his drop in efficiency here. Against the Hornets, it's a lot easier to write off. Jonathan Schwartz, correctly, I say, in the comments here, says that the refs wouldn't let him guard LaMelo. Yeah, those were all I think all three. Was it three fouls? All three of the first half fouls against Jaden Ivey were extremely ticky-tack to me. I didn't like any of the calls. I thought LaMelo was getting a pretty ridiculous whistle, to be honest. So, it's easy to kind of write off the Hornets game. Ivy, he gets into foul trouble. It was questionable foul trouble. And then it's just tough to find a rhythm when you only play 24 minutes in an overtime game, right? As a starter who's supposed to be your number 2 option on offense. But then against the Bulls, it's a little bit less excusable. 3 for 12 against a team that does not have great rim protection. There was no reason for him to not be getting all the way to the rim every single time. Like I don't think he needed to be going to those floaters and mid-range pull-ups as often as he did. So that was some that stuck out to me here. And I just say I hope that he continues to put his head down and maybe does that more often than not. He is, but just up that percentage a little bit, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, what was good to see is when Cade went down and wasn't playing in overtime against Charlotte, like Ivy made a couple nice plays, especially that pass to Stewart for a shot near the rim. Like that was an incredible pass. He ended the game with 5 assists. So it was nice to see him make some plays as well, especially when you don't have your primary initiator on the floor. Like you need someone to do that. And we've seen that the Pistons be hampered by not having that, I guess, traditional backup point guard on their roster. So yeah, I don't think it's a huge setback for Ivy. Like, I don't think this is going to be a long slump by any means. I think just had an off night against Chicago, just like pretty much the entire rest of the team did. And then he gets into foul trouble against Charlotte, and then it's just tough to get going. And then he all of a sudden absorbs all this responsibility in overtime when Cade is down as well. So I hope he bounces back soon. I don't really see any reason for him not to. But yeah, tough couple games, especially after that great performance against Washington.
That's a great point because if he doesn't get into foul trouble against the Hornets, I wonder what kind of game he would have had. I thought the first 3 minutes there in the first quarter, he was very aggressive in looking for a shot and looking for chances to get to the rim, which is great. And I think we saw that really play out then in overtime where I thought he had a pretty productive period. So if you take away the foul trouble, you let him get into rhythm. Maybe we're not even talking about this, right? Maybe it's just one off game against the Chicago Bulls, and then it's back to your usual the usual Jaden Ivey experience that we've seen so far this season. So I'm with you. I'm obviously a big fan of his game, so I think he's certainly going to bounce back. But just no question, tougher week for him, and like you said, tough week in general for the Pistons after that very good start. Interesting that they followed up their first real blowout win with a game that really wasn't even as competitive as that final score looked against the Bulls.
Yeah, and I mean the game against Chicago was definitely a letdown spot, especially the second night of a back-to-back where where you're traveling, I really
Well,
would
the
have liked.
Bulls had a back-to-back too,
Yeah, yep.
and they
So
they got blown out the night before though, so you knew they were coming in focused.
yeah, I mean, I really would have liked to see them get the game against Charlotte, especially after how the
Mhm,
first game against Charlotte
mhm,
ended with
mhm.
Brandon Miller getting that putback game winner. And man, Malik Beasley got a revenge opportunity at the end of regulation and had that offensive rebound and that floater that he missed. Really would have liked to see that one go
Both were
down
good
and
looks too.
yeah, get a little bit of revenge there. But I guess after Beasley missed that, LaMelo got a very clean look at the end, which he definitely should have made. And then overall, it's tough to just string together in overtime. So that one, especially with the turnovers too, was a little bit tougher to swallow. And I hope it. I don't. I don't think they're gonna like wallow in these by any means. I mean, they have a tough game this weekend against Orlando, but hopefully they bounce back and at least it was still competitive. Especially they were down 20 at one point against the Hornets, and they were down like 12 in the or 14 in the fourth quarter. So it was nice to see them at least come back, but would have loved to see them pull it out.
So before we get to a couple of questions here, I want to focus on one thing that has really stood out this past week here for the Pistons, and that's a guy that we really haven't talked about much. But how about Wendell Moore Jr.?
Oh yeah,
What a
he's
cool
been great.
story, huh?
Yeah, he's been great, and especially someone who didn't have a spot in the rotation, being able to lean on him when you need to, especially while you're waiting for Asar Thompson to come back. He's put in some positive minutes. I mean, that I saw someone mention it in the chat, that lob he tried to make to Ivy in overtime against Charlotte, and Brandon Miller like skied out of nowhere to pull that one down. Like
Yeah,
that.
I don't know. That's an incredible play, more so than a mistake on him to me.
Yeah, 100%. But yeah, I mean, I thought his on ball defense was good, and yeah, he's brought some positivity to the lineup, and he doesn't get a ton of shots by any means, but he's shown that he can make some when he gets some opportunities. Like he's made some pretty big threes at certain points. He made one against Charlotte, and I remember a couple others before. So it's nice to have that guy at the end of the bench that you can go to. That I mean, Paul Reed was a DNP CD against Charlotte, and Wendell Moore got those minutes. Like I thought you would have saw more minutes from Paul Reed, but Wendell Moore fills a need. And he's been good in like the limited opportunities he gets.
Yeah, just looking at the Charlotte game, right? Like you said, so he did make a three. He had 7 points because he got another basket and made 2 free throws. But he had 7 rebounds, 4 assists. He had a steal, a block, only 1 turnover. He's a real physical, like six
And
four,
that
6'5"
turnover was the
guard.
Brandon
Yeah,
Miller.
and the turnover was the incredible, absolutely incredible play
Yeah.
by Brandon. Not to even tip it. Can we just he didn't even
That
tip it. He caught it. That was
That was like
unreal.
a football, like who if it's an interception or completion to a
Yeah.
receiver, like that's number one on Sports Center, the play
Yeah,
Brandon Miller
absolutely.
made.
And he wasn't even in Moore's field of vision too when that pass was going up. It looked like he came from behind him and snagged. That was an unreal play.
Wendell Moore made the right play. Like
Yeah,
it was
he
it
did.
was just an incredible play by Brandon Miller.
Unreal, unreal. But anyway, no. So Moore, he had a great game, and it's just I don't know. It's cool to see these guys that are a little bit more on the fringe, right? But clearly have NBA talent. He's a physical defender. He's athletic enough. He plays with a high level effort. He's got a good looking jump shot. That's a guy that just needs a shot, every now and then, just needs a chance, and it's really cool. I think to see him really capitalizing on it when the Pistons have guys get into foul trouble or need injury relief. He's stepping up, and that's awesome. That's really awesome. There was a stretch where I thought he was playing better than Simone Fontecchio about a week ago, and that's not something I ever would have guessed.
Yeah, I agree. It's cool to see after he didn't get a ton of opportunity, and in Minnesota and he comes to the Pistons in a salary dump. We don't know if he's even going to be on the roster, but having a guy like him at the end of the bench makes sense. So happy to see him take advantage of those minutes. And yeah, he got 21 minutes last night. Ron Holland got just under 14. So it's good to have different players to go to. And yeah, I'm with you. I thought you could rely on him a little bit more than Fontecchio at times, which I didn't think would be the case either. I'm surprised a lot about the season Fontecchio has had so far, but if you have a guy like Wendell Moore that you can go to, I mean, he's playing himself into like maybe he won't get minutes every night, but when you need it, he's a guy that you're comfortable giving minutes to.
Yeah, absolutely. And final note, but shout out Simone Fontecchio, because if you want any sort of silver lining here, that's not just Cade Cunningham out of these the Bulls and the Hornets games, it's that Simone Fontecchio looks like he got his rhythm back. And that should be pretty big and important, I would say, for the team moving forward. But let's jump into this question here. It's from our guy Rames in the DBB comments. And I love the setup of the question, but he says, sheet or sham, the Detroit Pistons will continue to rate as a top 10 defense at the end of the season. And as I am the creator of sheet or sham, know that my answer is the correct one. So I'll let you guess.
Okay. I'll be really surprised if your answer is not sham. But and
you're correct.
Okay. I saw I saw your notes you put together on this, but one part was what I was thinking. If you go and just look at team defensive rating, the Pistons right now are at 111.6, and that's 11th. I believe they were like 6th before the game against Charlotte, right?
I don't know if it was 6, but it was top 10.
Okay. So now at 111.6, the Spurs are 8th at 111.1, and then after that it jumps up a bit. And then the Celtics are 13th at 111.9. The Nuggets are closely behind them. So there are like almost 10 teams within that 1 point range of the Pistons. And I think they've done a good job at executing what JB Bickerstaff wants to do, which is limit paint touches. Like they're up there in opponent points in the paint. They're top 10, giving up almost 46 points a game. And then also a big part of it is they've been a really solid rebounding team, especially on the defensive end of the floor. They're currently sitting at 3rd, tied with Chicago, and Memphis and Milwaukee are closely behind, but they've been good at. The issue comes in with when you have a matchup like Chicago, when you have a guy like Nikola Vucevic who you're letting him get threes and he's taking them and making them. But when it's a better matchup, I think the Pistons have been good at letting the other team get the shots that they want to give them and then making things a little bit hard and making it difficult for them to score in the paint. And then when it comes to ending the possession, they've been pretty good at it too. I don't know if their mark right now is sustainable just because things are going to level out and they don't have, like, Isaiah Stewart has been incredible as a rim protector for someone at his size, and Asar Thompson will definitely help when he gets back. I just think overall they're probably not going to be a top 10 defense, but that's not to say they'll be much more improved than what they were over the last season.
Yeah, so you already brought up a couple of the quote unquote good stats, right? So that they're 3rd defensive rebounding, like you said, and that's not necessarily an overperformance either. Their defensive rebounding percentage is 6th. So they're slightly overperforming where their defensive rebounding percentages, but at the same time, it's not excessive, right? It doesn't look like an outlier. They're right around where they should be. So that's a really good sign. They're 10th in blocks, which is great. That's an improvement. 14th in fast break points allowed, 8th in paint points allowed, which is what you mentioned. And there are a couple of things kind of driving that, but they're 23rd in pace. So they're sticking teams into a half court game more often than not. And then they're not fouling shooters all that often. They're only 13th in opponent. They're 13th in opponent free throw rate. So basically what's going on, and this is exactly what you said, this is the JB Bickerstaff scheme, so to speak. This is what the coach wants them to be doing. They're playing slow. They're not fouling a lot of shooters. They're blocking enough shots to make guards think twice about coming into the paint. And then they're forcing a lot of one and dones on jump shots. And that's probably it, right? That's the good stuff. Now there is some bad, or at least some things to be concerned about. The first one is that they're 22nd in turnovers per game, and it's generally hard to maintain a slow pace. It's generally hard to prevent fast break points when you're one of the worst teams in the league at turning the ball over, which tend to lead to fast breaks. So that one might be a little bit of an overperforming there. As well, they're last in steals in the NBA, and it's not even close. They're an entire steal behind the 29th ranked team. And then, so you brought up the defensive rating, that they're kind of in a cluster of teams for that. They're also in a cluster of teams for blocked shots. There are about 10 teams that are between 5 and 5.9, and the Pistons are at 5.4. So that could be anywhere from, they could be all the way up into the top 10, or they could be down into the bottom 10 even. So basically it's, can they keep it up? I don't know. Oh, I should also mention, this was actually kind of nuts. So their 4 best shot blockers on the team right now are Isaiah Stewart, Jalen Duren, Tobias Harris, and Cade Cunningham. 3 of those guys are averaging career highs right now. 3. So that also feels a little bit like an outlier reach. I don't know. There's reason to be concerned. At the same time, I think that what we've seen so far has been really impressive. And the work that JB Bickerstaff has done to get a good scheme, to get everyone to buy into that scheme, has been really impressive. So top 10, I'm going to say sham on that. But like 15th, right in the middle of the pack, I think that's possible. And I absolutely would not have said that to start the year. So that's a credit to JB Bickerstaff to me.
Yeah, and I think a big reason for where they're sitting right now is honestly Cade and Ivy. I mean, Ivy has a lot to clean up as a defender. I saw a YouTube user mention his defense against Charlotte in the chat. Like, LaMelo was blowing by him and kind of just
tough to play defense when you're not allowed to touch the guy, though.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to be that guy today on that one. I can't let that go.
Yeah, and I mean, LaMelo's a tough assignment for anyone, but just zooming out, I think both Cade and Ivy have shown improvements, at least as defenders and as the first line of defense. Like, that's super important, especially when we have a ton of questions about the last line in the starting lineup. So just them being able to make things difficult. And I know the coach speak term around it is defense has to be something that you want to do, but it really is true. I think that we've seen extra effort, extra pressure from those guys. And I mean, Cade specifically has looked pretty good. I think Ivy still has a ton of work to do, but I think some points he's looked good, some points he's looked not so good. There's a ton of stuff to clean up. But after Isaiah Stewart playing pretty incredible defense, I think you can go and look at those two as guys that are really helping like drive what this team is doing defensively.
Yeah. And I honestly, this is a bit of a tangent. I've always really hated the idea or the catchphrase that, defense is just effort. To me, it's always bothered me because it's not. There's so much skill that goes into the defensive side of the ball. There's so much smarts, right, that guys have to become very good defenders. And then, of course, there's the athletic like minimums that you have to have in order to be proficient or really excel, right? So there's a little bit of that God-given side of it too. But like your best defenders in NBA history or even in recent history, you want to look at Kawhi Leonard. Yeah, he played really hard, but he's also incredibly smart. He was reading the offense and what was happening in front of him before the guys were sometimes even knew the play that they were running occasionally. He was just that on top of it. He obviously had all the physical gifts in the world too. So yeah, like, I don't know. That's just a tangent, but that one's always been something that's bugged me a little bit. Because we wouldn't say that about offense either, right? Scoring the ball is just not about playing hard. There it could be, that's part of it, but there's also all this other stuff, and I don't want to diminish it. For like Isaiah Stewart, he's really, really good at using his hands in drop coverage. That's a skill. He's worked on that. That is impressive. It's a fun little thing. But we should stick with the defense. And I want to go to this question here, which it was at Avid Sports Reader on Twitter. I hope he's okay that we're going to use this. I never officially asked him, but he added both me and Bryce Simon on Twitter with this. And I looked into it, and it's actually pretty wild. So he says that he finds it under-discussed that not only are the Pistons better on defense with Isaiah Stewart and 4 other starters out on the floor, but the offense has also been almost 9 points per 100 possessions better as well. And so I want to let you respond to that, and then I want to go through some absolutely wild lineup data that I found last night, and we can dive into that too.
Yeah, so I think I know what your lineup data is gonna say, but overall, it's very telling when you saw in the Charlotte game, like JB putting Isaiah Stewart in and the team looking much better on the floor. And I mean, Jalen Duren, all the questions that we had, like their defensive lapses. And then I feel like there are times where he does do what he can to make a play, and then it ends up into being a foul called on him. And you can kind of just tell he gets a little demoralized by it. And what you brought up, Wes, about like just the skill of defense, Stewart looks really good. He always has. And I think that's just a level that we're not seeing from Jalen Duren right now. And you can tell other teams are just trying to pick on him, whether it's LaMelo trying to get him out on the perimeter and he's putting up a shot from there, or other teams.
The entire Bulls roster in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, and like it's teams going at him in the paint a little bit too, and either trying to get a foul call or just like bullying their way into an easy shot. But yeah, it is kind of telling, like definitely defensively, how much better the team looks when Isaiah Stewart is out there. And I mean, Jalen Duren, he didn't have much I don't think he put up a shot until the fourth quarter against Charlotte. So overall, it's kind of like, it's such a tough situation because what Isaiah Stewart brings off the bench is tough to replace. And if you put him in the starting lineup, like, yeah, it'll look good. We know it looks good, but then what do you do for the other minutes? What do you do if Isaiah Stewart gets in quick foul trouble? Is Paul Reed
which he's prone to do?
Right. Like that was an issue with him when he was starting. And like, is Paul Reed the answer? Do you go and get another third big with more size to fill your last roster spot? Whatever it might be. I feel like it's such a sticky situation, but overall, like what you can point to is everything just looks a little more cohesive, definitely defensively, when Isaiah Stewart is out there.
So the numbers absolutely back up your eye test, and they do it in a very stark way. So I just went and looked through lineups that have logged over 25 minutes total so far this season. So to get at least a minimum of a sample size here, there are 4 lineups where the only thing that's different is one has Duren, the other has Stewart, right? So there are 2 lineups that everything's the same, and then just those 2 switched, and that's happened twice. So that's the 4 total lineups. I'll just do this first one here. This is the larger minute sample one. That's the starting lineup, right? Cade Ivey, Tim Hardaway Jr., Tobias Harris, Jalen Duren. That's been about 149 minutes so far this season. They are minus 2.9 points, minus 15 3-point attempts, plus 6.5 defensive rebounds, plus 3.2 offensive rebounds. They break even on assists. They're a minus 9 on steals, a plus 0.6 in blocks, and they're a +7 in turnovers. And now these are all box score numbers per 100 possessions compared to the opponent, right? The opponent that the Pistons are playing for that period of time. And I bring that up to say that the +7 turnovers is really bad. That means they're turning the ball over 7 more times than their opponent when that lineup's out on the floor. All right, now let's sub in Stewart for Jalen Duren. Everything else is the same. It's still Cade, Ivy, Tim Hardaway Jr., and Tobias Harris. And now we have Isaiah Stewart. There have been 62 minutes with this lineup played. They are a +15.2 in points. They're +7.2 defensive rebounds, but a -10.3 offensive rebounds. However, again, back on the positive now. We're looking at +13.8 assists, +3.9 blocks, only +1 on turnovers, and a -2.6 on steals. So that is a big swing, to put it mildly. And that's just the starters.
Yeah, what sticks out to me there is, I mean, yeah, the overall numbers say the stats back up. The team looks better when Stu is in there in place of Duren. I think when Jalen Duren's out, you're giving up some second chance opportunities, but like the argument with myself on that is Isaiah Stewart does a solid job, a decent amount of time at getting putbacks himself, and at least fighting for rebounds as well. And I think YouTube user brings it up pretty well in the chat. Like, what's not the same is you're generally not playing against the other team's starters with Stu. And then also putting Stu in the starting lineup also puts him in a position to fail rather than using him in the role that's his long-term fit. I completely agree with that. And honestly, I don't think I can put it better myself. So like the issue there just becomes, do you make a change to the starting lineup? Do you bring Stu in earlier, like, and risk him getting into foul trouble early and then put yourself in a position? Or do you just go out and try to get a starting center? And then what happens with Jalen Duren on that? Do you send him out in a trade? Do you find a role for him elsewhere, like coming off the bench with Isaiah Stewart, maybe not playing together, whatever it might be? It's just such a tricky situation. And honestly, like, I feel like the logical answer right now is there's just not going to be a change, at least until there's something personnel wise that shifts in the on the roster.
Yeah, I agree. The logical answer is there's no answer. And what I want to do one more of these because it's also pretty wild.
This is the one that was eye-popping to me.
Yeah, this one's eye-popping. So this one was exactly to what YouTube user was saying here, saying it's not the same as that. What isn't the same is you're generally not playing against the other team's starters when Isaiah Stewart comes in. And that was my first thought as well. So I was really happy there was this second lineup where that was the case, right? So now we're going to get a bench rotation in. This isn't all bench players. This isn't all starters, and it's just Stu subbed in for Duren. We have another bench player out there on the court. So this is at least, you could assume, a mix, right? A mix of starters and bench guys on the other side of the ball. I'm going to start with Isaiah Stewart now. So let's say that first rotation happens. Ivy comes out, Duren comes out, Beasley, Stewart come in. That's pretty common. JB Bickerstaff does that quite frequently. So that's at about 30 minutes played. It's 29 minutes, 28 seconds. So right about at 30 minutes. They are +9 in points, +18.2 in three-point attempts, -1.6 defensive rebounds, +7.3 offensive rebounds, -7.1 assists, -1 steal, +5.1 blocks, but they are actually -1.6 turnovers, which is a good number. All right, same lineup. We're going to sub in Jalen Duren. Also 30 minutes played, -52.8 points, +1.1 three-point attempts, -4.1 defensive rebounds, when you get minus on a rebound stat when Jalen Duren's in, +2.3 offensive rebounds, -25.2 steals or assists. Sorry, -25.2 assists, -12.3 steals. minus 0.1 blocks, and to go right along with that steals number, plus 10.9 turnovers. Good Lord.
Yeah, that I saw this in our show notes, and that was the one when I was looking through these different lineups that I was like, oh dear, that that is not good. Like, there's really no other way to
Yeah.
put it, honestly. And I mean, yeah, 30 minutes. It's a much smaller sample size than the starting lineup group we went through, but I mean, like, okay, let's remove how poor those numbers are with like the Duran and Beasley sub in. I feel like the bench rotation when you bring in Beasley and Stewart, like you mentioned, JB does a lot. Like how good that lineup one looks through the eye test that seemingly everyone sees, and then also these numbers. Like I feel like that's almost telling us that right now there's just nothing to change. And like YouTube user brought up, it wouldn't change a thing. This team is far exceeding my expectations. Like I agree with that as well. I think it's just a long term thing that you have to think about. And if Jalen Duren is going to be what he is on defense, we know he's not floor spacing big by any means. Like, what's your plan for the future? As I guess bleak as that sounds.
Well, that's how it has to be framed, right? I mean, Ivy and Duran are coming up into contract extension talk, and both of those guys are, kind of making their pitch for why the Pistons ought to pay them more money to keep them around long term. So, I mean, my head's in the exact same place as yours, and actually as YouTube user. Like, I like what Bickerstaff has been doing with the rotations so far this year. I also wouldn't change anything with the lineups right now. This team is exceeding the expectations I had for it, and they've generally been fun to watch in just about every game this season. So that's a massive win to me. But at the same time, like those numbers are really bad.
Yeah.
They're really really bad, and I'm okay with it. For developmental reasons, because that's how this should be set up. They're still not in a position where they're going to push for the playoffs or anything like that, or at least I don't think that they are. But the stark difference between just those two players being swapped out into a lineup, is pretty incredible. And for whatever it's worth, it's generally true with four-man combinations as well. I didn't go into as much detail here. I was just kind of looking at the points numbers, but swap in Stu for Duran, and your lineup basically went from green to red if we're talking accounting, right? Like green, you'd be in the positive, you're outscoring your opponent. Red, you're no longer doing that. Now in the red, you're being outscored by your opponent. That's generally true if we put Duran in for Isaiah Stewart, if the other three men were the exact same in that four-man combination. So like this is a consistent thing, and it very closely pairs with that eye test that you brought up and that I agree with. And that's just the team looks better with Isaiah Stewart, which is a little wild given how Isaiah Stewart started the year. So I want to give him a shout out too, because he's playing really well and he's a big reason they are where they're at. But on the negative side of that coin, yikes, I can't think of a different word.
Yeah, I also think, just to pick out one more thing from this, I think the turnover numbers are interesting. Just the fact that they're much better with Isaiah Stewart on the floor. I mean,
And
Jalen
that
Duren,
makes sense. That makes a lot of
right?
sense.
He's Jalen Duren is more, and obviously it's not just Duren making the turnover or Stewart on these within these lineups, but like Duren's more prone just because of the playmaking and passing ability he has, the things he tries to do. But with Isaiah Stewart, I think it's interesting because turnovers have been an issue with him at times as well. And if he was put in situations where he was forced to put the ball on the floor, oftentimes like not good things have happened. And I mean, I don't think he is improving as a ball handler by any means. He's just being put in better situations where he's not out on an island and forced to make something happen and then not good things follow. So I think that's another positive sign of like how well Stewart has been playing with the groups that he's been playing with.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I mean, now Isaiah Stewart had a really rough turnover night against the Hornets. I think he sailed a
Mhm.
couple of passes into the third row.
Oh, and like 2 in a
Yeah,
row as
yeah,
well.
really unusual. They were both kickouts. I think he had 3 turnovers in a row. All of them were some form of a kick out from the paint. That, but to his credit, that's been unusual. It's 100% to me. I think it's absolutely just a difference in how they're being used. When
Yeah.
Isaiah Stewart's out there, his role on offense is a lot more narrow. He plays pick and roll and occasionally pick and pop. And if he's out on the perimeter and he's open, they expect him to shoot the shot. That's about it for Isaiah Stewart. He'll do a DHO here and there, but they do try to use Jalen Duren a little bit more as a hub because, as you
Mhm.
said, there's maybe that playmaking potential there. But something worth pointing out is that Isaiah Stewart right now, this season, is averaging about, I think it's 4.4 assists per 100 possessions. Want to take a guess at how many Duren is averaging?
Oh, man. It just tell me.
5. It is not a big difference at all.
Okay.
It's an insignificant difference. But those turnovers are a capital P problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not I mean, it's just like you can't have your big turning the ball over 3 times a game, and that's been an issue for both of them at times, so it's just about how they're being used, like you mentioned, and Duran tries to make more things happen, and I mean, offensive fouls too, that is a big part of the turnovers for both of them, but I feel like I've seen more from Duran, but he's also at times playing more, so it makes sense.
Now, I know you and I already said we really wouldn't change anything with the lineups, but Nashawn Smith got this question into our live chat early. And so that is why I had us go through all of these stats here, these interesting stats about the difference between Isaiah Stewart and Jalen Duren in lineups first. And his question is this: which is more likely, Tobias Harris or Jalen Duren not starting? And um, I think we're going to agree.
So my gut told me Jalen Duren when I saw this question, just because of everything we just talked about how Isaiah Stewart, everything he does defensively, all the numbers that Wes just put out on the table. The interesting thing with this is like when Asar Thompson comes back, we talked about this last week. We think he's going to be eased in, and it's just going to take some time with him. But what if he's eventually in the starting lineup? Like, who comes out? But even if Asar goes into the starting lineup, I don't think Tobias is the one coming out. I mean, you paid him $26 million a year. Like, he's going to start. You saw what he did against Charlotte, and he's had some rough games as well. But I just think Tobias is going to start. So if I had to pick one, it would probably be Duran. But I could also see an argument on like who's the odd man out if Asar Thompson is input into the starting lineup.
I mean, as much as I wouldn't like it if Asar Thompson started, providing that Duren is still starting,
Right.
um, you'd have to think the odd man out is Tim Hardaway Jr., right? I mean, they
Yeah.
just paid, like you said, they paid Tobias all that money, and Tobias hasn't been playing poorly. He's been playing a little bit below his past few season averages, and
Just
his
sometimes
3-point
the
shot's
shot
been
doesn't go
down.
down.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much the whole deal with him, right? His points per game are I think it's 2 or 3 points down below where he's been when he was with Philadelphia the past few years, but it's just cuz he's shooting a worse percentage from 3, and he's got so
Mhm.
much history as a shooter. You expect that reasonably so to go up here and to kind of self-correct. So, look, I don't think there's really any way that Tobias Harris is going to be the one benched. And, the reason that a player would get benched here would be either for developmental reasons or to help the team win more games. Jalen Duren's not going to get benched for developmental reasons. That doesn't make any sense. But if JB Bickerstaff decides the team needs to win more games, which, to be honest, I'd have a little bit of an issue with, it'd have to be Duren. That's
Mhm.
I mean, those numbers are pretty obvious. If you want to make one switch and help the team get off to better starts at the beginning of each half and close games better, which he's already started closing games more often with Isaiah Stewart than Jalen Duren. That's a new thing that's happening about the past week and a half. You'd do that. You'd bench Duren. You'd put in Isaiah Stewart. So that'd be my guess. I don't think either's likely though, for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, I agree. And like Jonathan Schwartz brings up, like you can't start Duren and Nassar. Like, yeah, but I guess like what if it does happen? I don't think it will.
Put in Stu.
But yeah,
I'd be okay with that.
You can put in Stu, but yeah, I don't think Tobias will ever really be up for benching him, like out of the starting lineup at least. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't really think either of them are going to be out of the starting lineup for the foreseeable future. Remember, I forgot what game it was, but when the Pistons released the starting lineup where Stewart was input over Duren, and then it was just like a mistake, I was like, oh wow. So, but I don't remember what exactly happened with that. But I think maybe if we ever see a change to the starting lineup, like that might be it. But then what happens with Isaiah Stewart after?
Jalen Duren after.
Well, I guess I meant, sorry, like if Stu gets into like early foul trouble and then things like, and then you have to rely on Duren off the bench, and when now like it's clear that JB Bickerstaff wants to rely on Isaiah Stewart as the guy he can go to help defensively as well. So it's interesting. I think we're not going to see many changes, but maybe they'll surprise us one time.
Yeah, they're in a bit of a sticky spot here. And I mean, we kind of knew that going into the year, right? This is still a year of developing the young guys that you have and seeing what you have in guys like Jaden Ivey, guys like Asar Thompson, Jalen Duren, all of that. And then at the same time, it'd be nice for them to win more games, So, trying to balance that on a razor's edge was always going to be a challenge here for JB Bickerstaff. I think this is just the first real obvious kind of tipping point one way or another to see which way he wants to go as a coach. And you and I have the direction we'd like it to go, but it'll certainly be interesting to see which way JB Bickerstaff takes it. And then I'd just say to Tobias Harris, not starting, Tobias Harris to me seems like the kind of guy where he's such a great team leader. If someone beat him out for the spot, I think he'd be okay with it. I don't think he'd really be okay with just, we need to get Asar Thompson minutes, so you're coming off the bench. Yeah. That's, you paid him enough money to come be kind of a pillar in the short term of your franchise, and you don't really do that to those types of guys, especially if they are still performing relatively well compared to the money you paid them. So, maybe next year, right? Maybe next year, I think that could be on the table. This year, though, nah, I don't think so. I'll let you respond, then we'll get to our last one here from Pistons Talk.
Oh, no, I think you summed it up pretty nicely. I mean, YouTube user pointed out too, like we don't have an alternative to Tobias.
Right.
Yeah. So
I
like,
agree.
I feel like that is pretty much just like the stop and start there. There's guys you can give minutes to, but if Tobias Harris's minutes go down like a considerable amount, it just wouldn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And like, I think we mentioned on a previous podcast, when Asar Thompson comes back, maybe you drop Tobias Harris to like 30 instead of 33 minutes a game. Like that's fine. But that's not huge, right? And that's not a demotion. But anyway, so let's wrap up with this one. This is our guy Pistons Talk. It says, with the Brooklyn Nets open for trades, which players on their roster would you be interested in? I don't know if you have their roster pulled up or not, but I can read through a couple names if that would be helpful.
I pulled up their cap table, so I got it here.
Perfect.
I know when this report came out, the name that popped out was Cam Thomas. I mean, I don't think he makes sense for the Pistons. The name, I mean, obviously Nick Claxton, that was a name that the Pistons could have went after in free agency. He ended up back in Brooklyn. The thing that's nice about his deal is it's descending. So even though he's signed for this season and 3 more seasons, I think you could swing it. The one I'd be really interested in is Cam Johnson if he's available. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I think the issue with Cam Johnson is I think he would probably take the most to get, and like what are you willing to give up that the Nets are also interested in, but I just think it would be nice to have another wing shooter to help out, and then maybe he's a Tobias Harris an alternative for him. So yeah, the big ones that stick out to me are Claxton. If you want to go that way, like he could be your starting center. But what are you sending out? And then I mean, under the radar, I guess I'd be interested in Cam Johnson. The other ones you can throw out there are like Dorian Finney-Smith. I don't know if you like Schroeder is playing pretty well. You could bring him in as a backup, but I don't really see that as a realistic trade for the Pistons. So I think the one I'd be interested in the most that will probably take a lot, but I think it's doable is Cam Johnson.
Yeah, Cam Johnson would be a fun one. He's on a pretty reasonable deal, if I remember correctly. I think
it's like 23 and a half this year, 21 and a half next year, 23 and a half the year after. So he signed for 2 more seasons after this one.
Gotcha. Yeah, so like that's fine. That's a reasonable deal. I agree. You'd probably have to give up at least something interesting to get him. This year, though, as a wing that you could add next to Tobias Harris, who's 3-and-D, can kind of do it all, and just would fit in really well with Ivy and with Cade. I don't know if you could really do much better. I would be concerned about what you'd have to give up, though. I would worry about that a little bit. With Nick Claxton, I really like his game. I know he's struggled a little bit so far this year, but that contract is really enticing. The descending values are great for a player that young. He's only 25. He's a very good defender, a good shot blocker. He'd fit in really well with what the Pistons do defensively too, I think, as a 5. So that'd be a great fit. But again, we had a couple of comments here in the live chat saying, would you do Duren for Claxton straight up? I think they'd say no to that. I think at this point in their careers, Nick Claxton has proven to be a better player than Jalen Duren is. I think it would have to take more. And then, of course, salary-wise, it would have to take more than that. So a name that, oddly enough, stood out to me would be a flyer on maybe Day'Ron Sharpe, defensive center. I know he's a little undersized, but that's, I guess, on theme for this Pistons big man rotation. I think he's 6'9". He's hefty, though. He's strong. He's got a good base, and he could be a guy that maybe competes with Paul Reed a little bit for those third center minutes. And being that he's only 23, maybe there's something long-term there that could be mined.
I will say I like that one. I think
for cheap, of course, for cheap.
Right. The other thing I'll just throw out there is Dariq Whitehead and Cade. They either played in high school together or just went to the same high school. I remember Cade was talking him up in his draft year. So I wonder, he's had a ton of injury problems. I don't think he's playing it. I think he's back, but like not playing a ton. So I wonder if that's another flyer you take, but just another name I'll throw out there. Okay, Pistons talk. They played in high school together. So yeah, I'm sure Cade would be a fan of that one.
The challenge, I think, for the Nets is just where they are as a team. I'd imagine they're looking for more young assets, right? They want more swings on young players, more flyers like that, and they want draft picks. And at least where I'm at, I'm not really in a position where if I were the Pistons, I would be all that excited to give any of that up right now. So as interesting as Cam Johnson would be, I'm not sure the Pistons really have a package that the Nets would want for Cam Johnson. I think the same thing about a guy like Nick Claxton. Now, maybe if you just want to reset the clock, right? If you're the Nets and you want to reset the clock on second round pick contracts with Day'Ron Sharpe and with Dariq Whitehead, exchanging those for a second round pick for the Pistons in the future, or maybe some cash, or maybe just another vet at the end of the bench, something like that. That is something that I could see them being interested in because, well, like when I say that, it's because if I were them, that's what I'd be interested in. So yeah, it's just tough with the bigger names to find a fit. I think it's just tough.
Agreed. And yeah, just where both of the teams are. Yeah, I think it's like, I think Brooklyn is just going to want to take on contracts to bring in draft picks or flyers on interesting young guys, like you mentioned. And I don't know if the Pistons have a ton to offer them that they want to give up. And like, if the guy you want to take a flyer on is like Marcus Sasser, for example, like, I don't know what Brooklyn would be willing to give up for that. So I think there's a couple guys on Brooklyn like I'd be interested in, just like you mentioned, Wes, like finding a deal to get done, I think would be pretty difficult.
And they don't really have like a distressed asset young player either, right? Like if you were looking at the trade deadline and Trajan Langdon makes the decision that maybe he wants to trade Jalen Duren because he doesn't want to give an extension to him, or same thing for Jaden Ivey. If Jaden Ivey is not a guy that Langdon wants to extend, right? If you're looking to move one of those two guys, other teams are going to be interested because other teams are going to be able to get a couple months with them in their system and then go and see if maybe over the offseason they do want to actually offer that contract extension. It's kind of like a free trial with the young player, and they don't have to go to restricted free agency, all that stuff. So there'd be a market, there would be interest. But the Nets don't really have a player kind of like, if you remember a few years ago, that much maligned James Wiseman for Sadiq Bey deal, right? That's the kind of thing that you'd see.
Yeah, I was thinking of the same thing.
Yeah, they don't want to extend that guy, but they're in the same draft class and someone else might be interested. So you just swap. You just swap guys that the other team didn't want to extend. You get them on a free trial and you make your decision from there. Is pretty much what you'd be looking for, or at least what could be possible. And the Nets just don't have that. You know, Cam Thomas has been really good for them. I can't imagine that he's a guy they want to give up. And outside of him, they don't really have super interesting young prospects that aren't on second contracts. Nick Claxton's interesting. He's 25, but he's on his second deal. Cam Johnson isn't super young anymore, but he's not old. He's also on a second contract. That's more of where the Nets' resources is. And I wouldn't be all that interested in that at the moment either.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly like the James Wiseman Sadiq Bey trade, and the
something that every Piston fan wants to mimic. I'm sure that's the model to follow.
Well, the Warriors ended up getting like the 5 second-round picks for that, and all we've seen Trajan Langdon talk about still being in asset accumulation mode, things like that. Like, I mean, I wonder if there's like, if he really doesn't want to extend Jalen Duren and you want to get what you can out of him, like, I wonder if you just take whatever draft capital you can get. Like, I mean, I don't know if you can get somewhat of a protected first, maybe like a very heavily protected first or things like that. But
depends on which.
Yeah, I feel like Langdon is looking for ways to acquire draft picks still. And like, I mean, your young players are like probably the best way to do that, unless you're trading like a Malik Beasley or whoever it might be, like a veteran on an expiring deal to a team that's contending, and seeing what kind of picks you can get there.
Yeah, you know, we've talked about this before, but I still think this is way too early. But when we get to the trade deadline, the most likely interesting thing that could possibly happen for the Pistons, I think, would be a couple of those vets that the Pistons have, maybe just one, and then taking back 2 rather large contracts in order to get, you know, a future first round pick or a bunch of future second round picks. Because like you said, Langdon's been on record, right? He's been on record that we want picks. We want more picks. This is clearly a rebuild with a longer term vision, and that's great. But I would anticipate he's pursuing that much more so than, hey, let's go get Cam Johnson, right? Let's go get
Agreed 100%.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there this week. If you guys are listening on Friday, which the podcast will be published Friday morning, as it usually is when we record on a Thursday, but the Pistons will play the Magic that night, which should be an interesting game. They play the Raptors on Monday and the Grizzlies on Wednesday. That is probably the last game that we will miss before we record next. So thank you guys all for listening, and Blake, take it away.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Reminder, if you're watching us live on YouTube, please like the video, hit the subscribe button on the Detroit Bad Boys channel. It really helps us move this thing along. Leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And a reminder, you can call our phone line to ask a question and hear your voice on the show. The number for that is 313-355-2717. And special thanks to Sean Korp, the managing editor at Detroit Bad Boys, for supporting the show. And shout out to you guys for all the great questions and talking points tonight. We'll catch you next week, whether on your commute or live with us on YouTube. We can't wait to talk more Detroit basketball with you all.